Chapter 16 of Recollections of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zachary Brewster Geiss. Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. Chapter 16. Early's Raid and the Washington Panic. President Lincoln visits the lines at Petersburg. Trouble with General Meade. Jubal Early menaces the federal capital. The excitement in Washington and Baltimore. Clerks and veteran reserves called out to defend Washington. Grant sends troops from the front. Plenty of generals, but no head. Early ends the panic by withdrawing. A fine letter from Grant about Hunter. Although Grant had decided against a further direct attack on the works at Petersburg, he was by no means idle. He sent out expeditions to break up the railroads leading into the town. He began extending his lines around to the south and southwest so as to make the investment as complete as possible. Batteries were put in place, weak spots in the fortifications were felt for, and regular siege works were begun. Indeed, by July 1st, the general opinion seemed to be that the only way we should ever gain Petersburg would be by a systematic siege. A few days later, we had an interesting visit from President Lincoln, who arrived from Washington on June 21st, and at once wanted to visit the lines before Petersburg. General Grant, Admiral Lee, myself, and several others went with him. I remember that, as we passed along the lines, Mr. Lincoln's high hat was brushed off by the branch of a tree. There were a dozen young officers whose duty it was to get it and give it back to the president, but Admiral Lee was off his horse before any of these young chaps and recovered the hat for the president. Admiral Lee must have been 45 or 50 years old. It was his agility that impressed me so much. As we came back, we passed through the division of colored troops, which had so greatly distinguished itself under Smith on the 15th. They were drawn up in double lines on each side of the road, and they welcomed the president with hearty shouts. It was a memorable thing to behold him whose fortune it was to represent the principle of emancipation passing bareheaded through the enthusiastic ranks of those Negroes armed to defend the integrity of the nation. I went back to Washington with the presidential party, but remained only a few days, as Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Stanton were anxious for my daily reports of the operations around Petersburg. On the return, I arrived at City Point on July 1st. The army occupied about the same positions as when I had left it a week before. 2 corps were engaged in siege work, their effort being to get possession of a ridge before them, supposed to command Petersburg. If they succeeded in this, Grant thought that the enemy would have to abandon the south side of the Appomattox, and of course the town. On the left, our line extended southward and westward across what was known as the Jerusalem Road, but at so great a distance from the Confederate fortifications as to have no immediate effect upon them. Farther around to the west, toward the Appomattox above Petersburg, the enemy's works extended, and the idea of enveloping them for the whole distance had been given up. The efforts to break up the railroads leading from Petersburg had been very successful, Grant told me. There were plans for assault suggested, but Grant had not considered any of them seriously. Before the army had recovered from its long march from Cold Harbor and the failure to capture the town, there was an unusual amount of controversy going on among the officers. Smith was berated generally for failing to complete his attack of June 15th. Butler and Baldy Smith were deep in a controversial correspondence, and Meade and Warren were so at loggerheads that Meade notified Warren that he must either ask to be relieved as corps commander, or he, Meade, would prefer charges against him. It seemed as if Meade grew more unpopular every day. Finally, the difficulties between him and his subordinates became so serious that a change in the commander of the Army of the Potomac seemed probable. Grant had great confidence in Meade, and was much attached to him personally. But the almost universal dislike of Meade which prevailed among officers of every rank who came into contact with him, and the difficulty of doing business with him, felt by everyone except Grant himself, so greatly impaired his capacities for usefulness and rendered success under his command so doubtful that Grant seemed to be coming to the conviction that he must be relieved. I had long known Meade to be a man of the worst possible temper, especially toward his subordinates. I think he had not a friend in the whole army. No man, no matter what his business or his service, approached him without being insulted in one way or another, and his own staff officers did not dare to speak to him unless first spoken to, for fear of either sneers or curses. The latter, however, I had never heard him indulge in very violently, but he was said to apply them often without occasion and without reason. At the same time, as far as I was able to ascertain, his generals had lost their confidence in him as a commander. His orders for the last series of assaults upon Petersburg, in which we had lost 10,000 men without gaining any decisive advantage, were greatly criticized. They were, in effect, that he had found it impracticable to secure the cooperation of corps commanders, and that therefore each one was to attack on his own account and do the best he could by himself. The consequence was that each gained some advantage of position, but each exhausted his own strength in so doing, while for the want of a general purpose and a general commander to direct and concentrate the whole, it all amounted to nothing but heavy loss to ourselves. General Wright remarked confidentially to a friend that all of Meade's attacks had been made without brains and without generalship. The first week of July, the subject came to pretty full discussion at Grant's headquarters on account of an extraordinary correspondence between Meade and Wilson. The Richmond Examiner had charged Wilson's command with stealing not only negroes and horses, but silver plate and clothing on a raid he had just made against the Danville and South Side Railroad, and Meade, taking up the statement of the Examiner for truth, read Wilson a lecture and called on him for explanations. Wilson denied the charge of robbing women in churches, and said he hoped Meade would not be ready to condemn his command because its operations had excited the ire of the public enemy. Meade replied that Wilson's explanation was satisfactory, but this correspondence started a conversation in which Grant expressed himself quite frankly as to the general trouble with Meade, and his fear that it would become necessary to relieve him. In that event, he said, it would be necessary to put Hancock in command. In the first days of July, we began to get inquiries at City Point from Washington concerning the whereabouts of the Confederate generals Early and Ewell. It was reported in the capital, our dispatches said, that they were moving down the Shenandoah Valley. We seemed to have pretty good evidence that Early was with Lee, defending Petersburg, and so I wired the secretary on July 3rd. The next day we felt less positive. A deserter came in on the morning of the 4th, and said that it was reported in the enemy's camp that Ewell had gone into Maryland with his entire corps. Another 24 hours, and Meade told me that he was at last convinced that Early and his troops had gone down to the valley. In fact, Early had been gone 3 weeks. He left Lee's army near Cold Harbor on the morning of the 13th of June, when we were on the march to the James. Hunter's defeat of Jones near Staunton had forced Lee to divide his army in order to stop Hunter's dangerous advance on Lynchburg. On the 6th, General Grant was convinced that Washington was the objective. The raid threatened was sufficiently serious to compel the sending of troops to the defense of the capital, and a body of men immediately embarked. 3 days later, I started myself to Washington in order to keep Grant informed of what was going on. When I arrived, I found both Washington and Baltimore in a state of great excitement. Both cities were filled with people who had fled from the enemy. The damage to private property done by the invaders was said to be almost beyond calculation. Mills, workshops, and factories of every sort were reported as destroyed, and from 25 to 50 miles of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad torn up. During my first day in town, July 11th, all sorts of rumors came in. General Lew Wallace, then in command at Baltimore, sent word that a large force of the enemy had been seen that morning near that city. The Confederate generals were said to have dined together at Rockville a day or two before. The houses of Governor Bradford, Francis P. Blair, Sr., and his son Montgomery, the Postmaster General, were reported burned. We could see from Washington clouds of dust in several quarters around the city, which we believed to be raised by bodies of hostile cavalry. There was some sharp skirmishing that day, too, on the Tenallytown Road, as well as later in front of Fort Stevens, and at night the telegraph operators at the latter place reported a considerable number of campfires visible in front of them. I found that the Washington authorities had utilized every man in town for defense. Some 1,500 employees of the quartermaster's department had been armed and sent out. The veteran reserves about Washington and Alexandria had likewise been sent to the front. General Augur, commanding the defenses of Washington, had also drawn from the fortifications on the south side of the town all the men that in his judgment could possibly be spared. To this improvised force were added that day some 6 boatloads of troops which General Grant had sent from the Army of the Potomac. These troops went at once to Fort Stevens. With the troops coming from Grant, there was force enough to save the capital, but I soon saw that nothing could possibly be done toward pursuing or cutting off the enemy for want of a commander. General Hunter and his forces had not yet returned from their swing around the circle. General Augur commanded the defenses of Washington, with A. McD. McCook and a lot of brigadier generals under him, but he was not allowed to go outside. Wright commanded only his own corps. General Gillmore had been assigned to the temporary command of those troops of the 19th Corps just arrived from New Orleans, and all of the troops in the Middle Department, leaving Wallace to command Baltimore alone. But there was no head to the whole. General Halleck would not give orders, except as he received them from Grant. The President would give none. And until Grant directed positively and explicitly what was to be done, everything was practically at a standstill. Things, I saw, would go on in the deplorable and fatal way in which they had been going for a week. Of course, this want of a head was causing a great deal of sharp comment on all sides. Postmaster General Blair was particularly incensed, and indeed with real cause, for he had lost his house at Silver Springs. Some of his remarks reached General Halleck, who immediately wrote to Mr. Stanton the following letter. Headquarters of the Army, Washington, July 13th, 1864. Honorable E. M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Sir, I deem it my duty to bring to your notice the following facts. I am informed by an officer of rank and standing in the military service that the Honorable M. Blair, Postmaster General, in speaking of the burning of his house in Maryland this morning, said in effect that the officers in command about Washington are poltroons, that there were not more than 500 rebels on the Silver Springs road, and we had 1 million of men in arms, that it was a disgrace, that General Wallace was in comparison with them far better, as he would at least fight. As there have been for the last few days a large number of officers on duty in and about Washington who have devoted their time and energies night and day and have periled their lives in support of the government, it is due to them as well as to the War Department that it should be known whether such wholesale denouncement and accusation by a member of the Cabinet receives the sanction and approbation of the President of the United States. If so, the names of the officers accused should be stricken from the rolls of the army. If not, it is due to the honor of the accused that the slanderer should be dismissed from the cabinet. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, H. W. Halleck, Major General and Chief of Staff. The very day on which Halleck wrote this letter, we had evidence that the enemy had taken fright at the arrival in Washington of the troops sent by Grant, and were moving off toward Edwards Ferry. It was pretty certain that they were carrying off a large amount of cattle and other plunder with them. By the end of another day there seemed no doubt that Early had got the main body of his command across the river with his captures. What they were, it was impossible to say precisely. One herd of cattle was reported as containing 2,000 head, and the number of horses and mules taken from Maryland was reported as about 5,000. This, however, was probably somewhat exaggerated. The veterans, of course, at once moved out to attempt to overtake the enemy. The irregulars were withdrawn from the fortifications, General Meigs marching his division of quartermasters, clerks, and employees back to their desks, and Admiral Goldsborough, who had marshaled the marines and sailors, returned to smoke his pipe on his own doorstep. The pursuit of Early proved, on the whole, an egregious blunder, relieved only by a small success at Winchester in which 4 guns and some prisoners were captured. Wright accomplished nothing, and drew back as soon as he got where he might have done something worthwhile. As it was, Early escaped with the whole of his plunder. One of the best letters Grant sent me during the war was at the time of this Early raid on Washington. When the alarms of invasion first came, Grant ordered Major General David Hunter, then stationed at Parkersburg, West Virginia, to take the direction of operations against the enemy's forces in the valley. Hunter did not come up to Mr. Stanton's expectations in this crisis, and when I reached Washington the secretary told me to telegraph Grant that, in his opinion, Hunter ought to be removed. 3 days later I repeated in my dispatch to Grant certain rumors about Hunter that had reached the War Department. The substance of them was that Hunter had been engaged in an active campaign against the newspapers in West Virginia, and that he had horsewhipped a soldier with his own hand. I received an immediate reply. City Point, Virginia, July 15, 1864, 8 p.m. C. A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War. I am sorry to see such a disposition to condemn so brave an old soldier as General Hunter is known to be without a hearing. He is known to have advanced into the enemy's country toward their main army, inflicting a much greater damage upon them than they have inflicted upon us with double his force, and moving directly away from our main army. Hunter acted, too, in a country where we had no friends, while the enemy have only operated in territory where, to say the least, many of the inhabitants are their friends. If General Hunter has made war upon the newspapers in West Virginia, probably he has done right. In horsewhipping a soldier he has laid himself subject to trial, but 9 chances out of 10 he only acted on the spur of the moment, under great provocation. I fail to see yet that General Hunter has not acted with great promptness and great success. Even the enemy give him great credit for courage, and congratulate themselves that he will give them a chance of getting even with him. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. End of Chapter 16.